Good morning, my name is Emma Rotherow and I'm the Floodplain Meadows Partnership Project Manager, a project hosted by the Open University. I'm here to present the results of a 3-year study into floodplain meadow restoration in England and Wales and argue the case for a change in land use types in floodplains to reflect the critical need for more sustainable and resilient agriculture. Floodplain meadows are species-rich grasslands in lowland river floodplains that have a haycut. The traditional management of an annual haycut followed by aftermath grazing has occurred in lowland floodplains for centuries, exploiting the natural fertility of floodplains and supporting rural communities. These are ancient and democratic systems and often have names that reflect this, for example Lammas meadows where hay is shared and grazing is in common, or local names including hams, ings or meads. Classic examples, such as the Oxford Meads, have documented evidence of the same long-term consistent management for more than 1,000 years. The slide shows some of the typical species of floodplain meadows, including great burnet, meadow foxtail grass, snake's head fritillary and marsh marigold. These are plant communities that have evolved around the haycut and are therefore derived from sustainable agricultural practices in floodplains. Floodplain meadows were once the major land use in lowland rivers, however less than 3,000 hectares now remain. 5 of these are designated as special areas for conservation and many are SSSIs. The map shows the known distribution today. Floodplains in England and Wales comprise a mixture of different land uses from natural and semi-natural habitats to intensive agricultural land and urban areas. Some form of intensive agriculture covers nearly 70% of English and Welsh floodplains, compared to just 11% for more species-rich habitats, while urban areas cover around 9.5%. Only 2.8% of floodplains across England and Wales are some form of neutral grassland. These figures are derived from modelled data produced through the CEH Land Cover Map, produced in 2015. However, the natural capital of semi-natural and species-rich habitats is significant and important, and nowhere more so than in floodplains, which have complex hydrogeochemical interactions and affect so many aspects of our lives, including through flooding, water provision and water quality. Understanding the values of these different ecosystem services will help us to reflect their importance. Ecosystem services of floodplain meadows include a very rich biodiversity with up to 42 different plant species in 1 metre square. They absorb floodwaters and remove nutrients from them. They sequester carbon in their deep alluvial soils. They are places of historical importance and a rich source of information about rural heritage, and meadows are one of the habitats most valued by the general public, offering places for inspiration and learning. All this whilst being a productive agricultural crop. We have tried to quantify these values in the paper referenced at the bottom of the screen, carried out under the Valuing Nature research programme. Floodplain meadows offer more ecosystem services than other land use types in floodplains, so should we consider them to be the most sustainable use of a floodplain? Given that these are very strong arguments for restoration of floodplain meadows, it was logical for us to want to find out how restoration of floodplain meadows is progressing across England and Wales. There are issues with restoring grasslands in floodplains that are different to dry grasslands. Those illustrated here, for example, including flooding, excess nutrients and soil compaction. Therefore, we secured a grant from the John Ellerman Foundation from 2015 to 2018 to visit floodplain meadow restoration sites across England and Wales. This project allowed us to find as many restoration fields as we could, collect physical data about each site and talk to the landowner or site manager about what they had done. We were then able to analyse these data using the methods shown in the table. So, what did we find? We visited 163 restoration sites across 20 counties, equating to 733 hectares of floodplain meadow restoration. This is a significant amount given that there are only 3,000 hectares remaining. The slide shows existing floodplain meadows as blue diamonds and restoration sites as yellow circles. Looking at some of the data we collected, we can see that pre-restoration land use varied, but was predominantly permanent grassland, with arable being the second most common pre-restoration land use. We also came across some more unusual land uses, including old allotments and pig fields, converted to floodplain meadows, and in some cases doing very well. Methods for restoration varied, but the most popular method was spreading with green hay. Using commercial seed bought from a supplier was the second most common method, and simply changing management from pasture to an annual haycut was third most common. Other methods included wild seed, typically from brush harvesting, plug planting, dry hay, and a mix of different seed sources on some sites. In order to try and quantify restoration progress, we devised a scale of success. The restoration fields visited are shown here and graded according to that scale, where a score of 1 is considered a failure, through to 5, which is considered a successful project. The allocation of categories was done by analysing botanical quadrat data to produce numbers for plant species richness, National Vegetation Classification Similarity Score, and the ratio of plants categorised according to whether they are competitive, ruderal, or stress tolerant. This ratio can be used to indicate whether vegetation is in early stages of succession, and a CSR ratio that is even across these factors suggests a more established community. The results show that 5% of sites were considered successful, a category 5, although if we include category 4 sites as well, we could consider that 25% were successful. However, 15% of sites were considered a failure in category 1. More than 50% of sites, categories 2 and 3, were considered to be in a transitional state, demonstrating some progress towards formation of species-rich meadows. The figures on the graph show the boundaries we set for our success categories. Using these categories, we were able to show whether a successful project was related to factors like landowner type, previous site usage, and method of restoration used. We found that landowner type was a significant determiner for outcome. 2/3 of sites within category 5, success, belonged to private landowners. The differences between private and public or charitable landowners as the two major categories of land manager were clear in category 1, failure, where the number of public and charitable organisations and the associated area managed were 3 times higher than that from private landowners. A possible reason for this startling finding is that private landowners are more likely to have access to machinery at the right time of year. Often, public or charitable organisations rely on contractors, which can make management more tricky, preventing them from undertaking consistent and responsive management post-restoration. Factors like pre-restoration condition of the field and method of restoration used were not significant in determining outcome. We also tried to classify sites according to how they had been managed after the restoration activity, giving each site a score based on 3 management elements. Firstly, was management consistent or inconsistent? For example, was there a regular hay cut each year at an appropriate time, or was a hay cut only occasionally done? Secondly, was management sufficient or insufficient? For example, were drainage grips maintained sufficiently to prevent soil anoxia? And finally, was management adaptive, with the landowner taking decisions about when to cut and how many animals to graze based on data, weather conditions and site conditions in any one year, or were decisions taken purely following the management guidelines? For example, were cutting dates in countryside stewardship agreements followed rigidly, or were they adapted depending on weather conditions in each year? These factors are all likely to affect the outcome of a restoration project, and each site was scored accordingly. We found that the quality of management across the 3 management categories is positively and significantly related to the successful outcome of a restoration project. In particular, and most strongly, the sufficiency of management showed the strongest positive correlation to restoration success. Was there a sufficient hay cut, drainage, grazing, propagules, and applications of propagules? Where the answers are yes to these questions, a better outcome is more likely. Additionally, the type of landowner was also related to sufficiency of management, where private landowners are significantly more likely to apply sufficient management post-restoration than private companies and charitable organisations. So post-restoration management is the key factor in driving project outcome. As Funboy3 and Bananarama once said, "It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it." Our conclusions are: post-restoration management needs to be adapted to the conditions in each year with a consistent, timely and flexible management approach. And repeated applications of seeds in whatever available forms will help speed up the process. So, looking at some specific examples of restoration, this site, Prior's Ham, was scored as a success category 3. Seed and green hay harvested from the adjacent National Nature Reserve were spread in 2010 and 2011. Good germination was observed in the first year. In 2012, however, the site was flooded for 10 months. This resulted in a massive increase in soil phosphorus and no ability to take a hay cut. The site remained too wet for too long for many species to survive. The recommendation, however, was always to cut the hay as soon as it was ready after the end of June and to ensure the site was grazed, allowing consistent management even after the floods. The monitoring data on the graph show Priors Ham as blue lines compared to a reference site as red lines where no restoration has been undertaken. As you can see, the species diversity initially increased but has subsequently fluctuated due to the fluctuating conditions, and the 2012-13 floods are reflected in the dip in species diversity. However, it has increased in diversity hugely compared to the starting point in the reference field and is moving towards a more typical floodplain meadow community. Swill Brook Meadow is an even more successful scheme, classified as 5 on our scoring system. It is a site owned by the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust as part of their Lower Moor Farm Nature Reserve. Much of the reserve is a very species-rich, very traditionally managed floodplain meadow, but Swill Brook Meadow had a history of year-round grazing with sheep and cattle and was species poor in comparison. In 2010, it was entered into a higher-level stewardship scheme for restoration of species-rich meadow through spreading green hay. In late July 2010, the meadow was cut tight to the ground and harrowed. Green hay was cut and big baled from a nearby meadow and transported 500 metres to Swillbrook Meadow, where it was spread within a few hours using a straw spreader. This is shown in the picture. After spreading, the meadow was left to settle for a few weeks, then grazed lightly by sheep. Following green hay application, the meadow has been managed with a hay cut after the 15th of July or occasionally later depending on weather conditions. Aftermath grazing is carried out by cattle, which graze a number of the fields together until the ground becomes too wet. The project has been monitored by the Floodplain Meadows Partnership through 15 1x1 metre quadrats and a further 10 quadrats in a nearby reference field called Side Ham to compare the success of the green hay application. The monitoring programme indicates that the work at Swill Brook Meadow is successfully recreating a species-rich sward similar to the floodplain meadow plant community. In 2011, just 12 months after the green hay application, species richness had increased significantly as shown by the red dots on the graph, as had the goodness of fit to the target floodplain meadow community. This continued in 2012, and the cover of species of more improved grasslands such as perennial ryegrass and white clover has continued to decline. The field is now similar in its species richness to some of the other floodplain meadow fields on the reserve. The costs were minimal as both sites were owned by the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, no commercial seed was required and machinery was readily available on the farm. So we have some key messages from this work. Firstly, there are 1.6 million hectares of floodplain in England and Wales. They are special environments in terms of the variety and extent of services they offer. Their uniqueness needs to be reflected in environmental land management schemes and other policies. A natural capital perspective can be used to inform and compare land use decisions in floodplains. However, only 10% of floodplains are currently delivering a wide range of ecosystem services. Secondly, 42% of floodplains are no longer connected to the river system, and there is therefore enormous potential to increase the extent of floodplain habitats that can provide us with multiple benefits. Thirdly, fewer than 3,000 hectares of species-rich floodplain meadow remain, plus 778 hectares of restoration. We know how to restore floodplain meadows, and there are plenty of case studies with evidence to show how they are progressing and what stops them from working. We need incentives from government, including a specific landscape element in elms for floodplains. And finally, floodplain meadow restoration alongside in-river restoration would significantly ramp up the extent of floodplains being managed more sustainably and benefiting in-river habitats. For this to happen, we need to facilitate more effective working between agri-environment scheme advisors and river restoration experts, now more than ever. And finally, many thanks to the various funders involved in this work and our wider project. If you are involved in a floodplain meadow restoration project or would like to start one, please do talk to us.